Okay, let me start this morning. I have a number of different things I want to try and bring into this talk on competition, prices, and the invisible hand. This is not going to be your standard economics presentation that you'd hear on competition and prices in a regular econ class, but I think I'm going to cover some of the issues. I'm going to draw from some of the things I mentioned yesterday. So let's start off. You know, in economics, how many of you have taken a basic introductory economics class? So some of you have. I mean, basically economics starts out talking about scarcity. We're in a world where things are scarce and our wants are unlimited. If you were to make a list of all the things you'd like to have, you know, it'd be a long list, but there's not enough of those for everybody in the world to have everything they want. Now that doesn't mean that we're naturally materialistic or that economics is about materialism, that all we want is stuff, you know, iPods and fast cars or whatever. Also violin lessons, piano lessons, seats at the opera. Classes, educational opportunities. There's not enough of all these things for everybody. So there's got to be some way of dealing with scarcity. So economics deals with the subjects that have to do with scarcity. And the core point, the start in economics is scarcity means we have to make choices. We have to make choices. We've got a limited amount of revenue, money, limited amount of time. We have to make choices about what we spend our money on among the various things we'd want. Even Bill Gates, who has no limits on the money he has. In fact, I don't think he could spend his money if he tried to, if he just bought stuff. But he has limits on his time. So he has to make choices about how he spends his time. So we all deal with this problem of scarcity. Scarcity leads to people to make choices. And the sort of the initial economic concept that's fundamental in economics is the concept of opportunity cost. Every choice has a cost, right? When you choose to buy something, to go to a movie, that has a cost, and the cost is personal, it's subjective, it's measured in what you give up to do it. So what does it cost to go to a movie around here?
12 bucks.
12 bucks? Okay, so 12 bucks is the money cost of going to a movie, but the real cost is the opportunity cost. The real cost is what you would have bought with that $12 and what you would have done with your time when you weren't going to a movie. So that subjective cost of going to a movie is personal for every person. That's one of the arguments against welfare programs that transfer income from people to people. You can't tell how much people value $10 or some amount of money or product because everyone has different values for their time. So your core concept, opportunity cost, it's what you give up when government spends money on a project, building a new highway, building a new battleship. The cost of that is not only the money cost, billions of dollars, it's the opportunity cost in a sense for government, what the government could have spent the money on, but also it's what everyday people could have spent the money on, right? The taxpayers. So when the mayor's out there cutting a ribbon for a new park or a new bridge, you see the benefits of the government spending, this nifty thing and the politicians involved in it, but you don't see the cost. You don't see what people give up all around the country as they are unable to buy or save because the government's taken the money in taxes. So again, core concept, opportunity cost. One of the key things about opportunity cost, in economics we talk about the law of supply and the law of demand, sort of key economic supply and demand issues in the market economy. But there's a core idea in here that has to do with what opportunity cost measures and why we need prices in a market economy. And the story is often told in the sort of socialist calculation debate that Ludwig von Mises and others in the Austrian school were involved in the debating the socialist economist. But they said that communism can't work because abolishing prices, which was a goal of the early communists, disrupts the communication system of a modern economy. And here's the example they often use. The Soviets are trying to build a railroad line from city A to city B, and they're trying to decide whether they want to build it all the way around a mountain range to get to city B, or whether they want to try and go through a tunnel in the mountains to get to city B. So they've got, the socialist calculators have this they're in a big meeting and they know all the raw materials for each route. The rail lines, the wood, the machinery, the dynamite to blow the tunnel, all this work, the number of hours involved, and they can figure out just how much resources they need for each each route. And the question is, what do they choose? Which is the most efficient route to get from city A to city B? You've got all these engineers and civil engineers and so forth. How do they decide? And often when I ask this to students at schools, the kids say, oh, around the mountain, around the mountain. No, through the mountain, like they guess. But the problem is, how do you figure out? How would you figure out the best way to do it? Let's say you're a civil engineer, you know a ton of stuff about building roads, railroads, blasting tunnels. How would you decide the best way to build that rail line in the Soviet Union?
Contrast the cost of each.
Yeah, but in the Soviet Union, there's no prices. You just have the materials. You've got the labor hours, the engineering hours, the raw materials, but no prices. So how do you figure out the best way to do stuff? I mean, that's how you do it in the US, right? You'd say, well, which one is least expensive and which one, let's say, is the most efficient line for the rails afterwards in terms of time and so forth. But without prices, you can't make these calculations. You just guess, right? And there's no other way to do it. And that's a core problem. Without prices, it's hard to measure. And what is it that the prices are actually measuring? When you choose the lowest price for the efficient way of doing it, what are you actually doing? Well, in terms of opportunity cost, what you're doing is you're comparing the next best alternatives for all those resources, right? When it costs you, $20,000 to hire these guys to work on it per person, what that is a measure of is how valuable they are in other occupations in the economy. Right? Each of those prices is a measure of opportunity cost. So you're pulling these people away from all sorts of jobs to do this project, and you want to do it in the least disruptive way for the economy. You want to pull people in that are the least expensive because they're giving up the least elsewhere. So if you had a project and you needed a bunch of petroleum engineers, they're like the highest paid engineers in the country. If you're graduating from college with a petroleum engineering degree, you have like $120,000 a year as your initial pay, right? It's a boatload of money in case any of you are considering a career in petroleum engineering. Why is that? Well, because there's a huge demand for oil and gas drilling right now, shale drilling all around the country, all around the world, and it's pulling people into that profession because it's very valuable. If you were to pull guys out of that profession to build a rail line or do something else, that's very damaging to the economy. So anyway, opportunity cost is measuring opportunities foregone. The socialist calculation debate basically says you can't run an economy without prices because prices are always measuring people's best available use of their time by the highest income they can make from it. Does that make sense? Okay, there's much more in that, but again, prices are measuring alternatives. We stopped with this slide yesterday talking about Adam Smith and the wealth of nations, but basically we were talking about in a market economy where the government's not involved, people are making that decisions. You have the spontaneous order system where people are communicating through prices. So Friedrich Hayek, I don't know if you know of the article, The Use of Knowledge in Society by Friedrich Hayek. It's like the key economic article of the last half of the 20th century. And Hayek used an example to discuss this. He talked about a flood in a copper mine in Chile. So there's a copper mine in Chile, it's producing 1/3 of the world's copper, and all of a sudden there's a big flood that floods out part of the mine, and all of a sudden copper ore is unavailable because of the flood. The question is, how does the world respond to a significant percentage of the world's supply of copper ore suddenly being taken offline? How do you accommodate that? Well, you could have meetings, you could have the UN convened and all these, officials and politicians meet and try and decide this stuff. But instead, what happens in a market economy is it's a sort of a informal, spontaneous process where the guys at the copper mines, they're going out to buy copper ore, and suddenly they call the mine and they find that copper ore is not available, so they got to call other places for ore to keep their refineries going. Then the other places find they've got all these extra calls for copper ore, so they have to hire more people and work overtime to try and get more copper ore to fill demand, but that's more expensive, paying people overtime and bringing in new resources. And so what happens, the people that are refining the copper, because the copper ore is more expensive, they have to raise their price of copper a little bit. The people that are using copper in pots and pans and other things find the price of copper has gone up a little bit. They begin to make choices of using aluminum instead of copper where they can. And in the end, it's you, people like you, walking into a Target planning to buy a new pan with a copper bottom on it, and you find all of a sudden the price is crossed out and it's $1 more expensive, and you decide to instead to buy an aluminum pan. So what's happening is all around the world, anybody who can make do with a substitute for copper does so because the higher price of copper is signaling them either to put off buying it. Yeah, I guess I don't need it right now, I'll use my old pan for another month or two. Or you buy a substitute. People that have to have copper can't use anything else. They still buy copper. So it is as if everybody in the world gets up in the morning and says, what can I do today to help reduce the world demand for copper by 20%? It's as if you're saying, look, I want to leave this copper for somebody that values it more highly because I don't need it right now. But nobody is consciously doing that. It's the price that's signaling that information, signaling a temporary scarcity. And this happens with a million products all over the world. The price of cornflakes, the price of Wheaties, when there's a drought and the corn supply goes down, the price of corn goes up. The price of cornflakes goes up in the store. The price of Wheaties goes down, relatively down compared to cornflakes. People buy more Wheaties, less cornflakes. This sort of trade-off process that prices are signaling is what's coordinating the production process around the world. Okay, does that make sense? That's what prices do. Now, competition, we talked about prices and signaling. What about competition? Well, here's sort of an odd way to talk about competition, the value of competition. Competition in religions, competition in worship. You think of competition in hamburgers or cars or, soft drinks, but you don't think of competition in religion. But one of the reasons I want to mention this is to talk a little bit about the dynamism that comes through competition. Competition is a searching process where people are trying to figure out better ways to do things. And we don't know the best way to make a hamburger. We don't know the best way to make a car. You've got engineers and people trying to figure out better ways to do it. Every week we have some new hamburger with some new fruit or vegetable thrown on top of it, from avocados to pineapples to who knows what. Fortunately, there's no kale yet on hamburgers. Hopefully that won't happen. Have you been subjected to kale yet? It's the parents. Your parents are reading about this, how it's healthy, so they're trying to figure out how to stick kale in your diet. And the kids are trying to figure out how to avoid it. Anyway, in religion, people running churches need customers. They need people to come into their church. They're offering a service, a very important service, but who knows? Everyone is a little different. Their needs are different. Who knows the best way to approach religious doctrines and communicate those with people, help them discover and improve? I mention this because, and you brought this up yesterday about the Reformation in Europe, and one of the dynamic things about it, to some extent, the Counter-Reformation and the Catholic Church's response, part of it wasn't positive, right? But part of it was positive. People looking back and say, okay, we need to clean up our act because we've got competition from a new version of Christianity, and there's a dynamism in that competition. Protestant churches are particularly keen on this. That's why they split up to 4,000 different kinds of Protestant churches. But partly it's an effort to try and figure out what the best way to deliver religious services are. This comes up in Rodney Stark's books, one of the reading, in Latin America. People think of Latin America as Catholic. It used to be Catholic. Virtually everyone was Catholic in Latin America. But that's not quite true, because what Stark mentions is for the last couple centuries, hardly anybody went to church. That Catholicism was a monopoly in Latin America, and in a monopoly, the people delivering the service end up not being that responsive to customers. So the church wasn't that responsive to people. You do this by measuring how many people go to services. One of the things that's happened in the last 50 years with the Church of Latter-day Saints and Protestant denominations being very active in Latin America is they've dramatically expanded church attendance among Protestant churches, which has led the Catholic churches to innovate and respond and be more dynamic, and more people are going to Catholic churches. So this competition dynamic is big. In England, whoops, what happened to my slide? In England, the government funds the Church of England. That is, it's an established church, the money comes from the government. What do you think that does to the incentives of the people who offer church services in the Church of England? Your money comes from the government no matter how many people attend your church on Sunday. What are your incentives? Well, you want to help people. You want to have people come, but you also like to read books and do other sorts of things. Customers are always a pain for any company. You only deal with them because you have to, right? You don't get money, but if you get money from somewhere else. So anyway, basically nobody goes to church in England. The church attendance in Europe is way, way down, partly with the government funding the churches. Government doesn't fund Islamic churches. Lots of people go to Islamic churches in Europe, but in terms of mainstream Protestant and Catholic churches where the government funds them, the incentives are mixed up. Okay, so a little story there. Environmentalism, to some extent, is a religion in the way people are presenting it and a way of thinking about the world, sort of a pantheism. In fact, there's a great book here at the Independent Institute called The New Religious Wars, and it talks about environmentalism versus economics as two religions, which may sound peculiar to you. It did sound peculiar to me, but it turns out the funny, weird story of this is the early advocates of economics as a form of welfare and eliminating poverty saw economics as a way of, changing the world, as almost a religious passion. And the early people in the American Economic Association, the founders of this effort, were all Presbyterian ministers, which seems odd. These people are the core people in early economics. Then the environmental movement gets going. People see wilderness cathedrals and people be able to have religious experiences with nature, and that environmentalism is this new thing to help us change the world. It turns out that the early environmentalists were all Presbyterian ministers. Sort of strange. I don't know why the Presbyterian Church is launching off in these different directions. But in any case, as a religion, sort of, the environmental groups trying to raise money in competition, the Sierra Club, a whole bunch of environmental groups, the Environmental Defense Fund, they're all advertising, trying to attract customers, donors, people giving them money, reading that stuff. That dynamic competition is part of what's generated so much enthusiasm for environmentalism. They're actively trying to reach people. They produce great documentaries and beautiful pictures, and that's a competitive effort to attract people to the sort of the church of the environment. Okay. I mentioned earlier the question, what's the best way to make a hamburger? Nobody knows. Competition's a discovery process. We try and figure it out. I talked yesterday about transportation. What's the best way to transport people from home to work? Right? If you're interested in transportation, again, a competitive discovery process. We have a huge problem with congestion in the Bay Area. People are jammed up in traffic trying to get where they want at morning and night. They take it for granted. They think it's normal, that it has to be that way. But we don't put up with that in other areas, at the supermarket or the drugstore or other places. We buy stuff, we don't have congestion. Why do we have it so much on roads? Well, part of the challenge, and this is a sort of a core idea, comes from William Easterly. You've got the planners and the searchers. In dealing with transportation issues, you've got a whole set of transportation planners in the federal government Department of Transportation, the California Department of Transportation, Bay Area, Rapid Transit, the BART, the bus people, and these planners are trying to figure out how to deliver transportation services to you, the customer. They don't know quite what the customer is going to want, and they can't use prices, right? The highways are free, the buses are subsidized, BART's subsidized, so they don't have prices. They're just trying to do this without private property and a market system. The government's trying to plan it. Now that's a different process than the searching process of entrepreneurs, business people that are making hamburgers and soft drinks and the things you buy in the marketplace. And part of the challenge here is the planners see things from the top down and try to plan how people should live, right? For example, the planners decided very restrictive rules for housing in the Bay Area. If you go to Santa Clara, which is where all these huge wealthy companies are and one of the wealthiest places in the world, you go to downtown Santa Clara and it's a dump. It's full of old buildings, two-story buildings broken down, and it's a big mess. Why? Because in Santa Clara, they don't allow you the freedom to build an office building or apartments that are 5 stories high, you have a, a peculiar system that is heavily regulated. So housing is super expensive in the Bay Area because of local and state regulations, mostly local and city regulations. So what do people do that are working in the Bay Area and find it's incredibly expensive to buy a house here? What do?
Move inland?
Move inland. So massive expansion of housing inland from Modesto, Livermore. A lot of those people are people that work here, but because the housing is regulated, they couldn't buy a house here or a condo here that they wanted, so they buy there, which means they're on the highway and they've jammed up the highways. It also contributed to other problems in the housing bust when fuel prices went up. But the point is the planners didn't plan for that. They didn't expect that. It's a big mess, and it's tied to their process of trying to plan from the top down instead of the bottom up. Quick story on transportation. In the early 1900s, you had buses and rail cars, light transit in the cities, and entrepreneurs, people that had purchased cars, saw an opportunity to make money. This is the story of the jitneys. The jitneys were people that just had a car of their own, and they decided they had some extra time in the morning or afternoon to take people to work. So they'd stop at the bus stop ahead of the buses with a sign saying where they were going downtown, and the price was a jitney, which is a nickel, and they would offer to give people a ride. So they'd pull in, people would pile into the car, and they'd go take them to work and take them right where they wanted to go. This system self-organized in Seattle, San Francisco, Portland, in other cities. Tens of thousands of people were getting rides from people they got to know through this jitney process who would come in and take people. And it was an incredibly dynamic, spontaneous searching process that provided inexpensive transportation and extra money from for people that had cars. It was a great system. Who do you suppose would be hurt by that system? Taxis?
The city.
How the city?
They wouldn't be making money from the transit system?
Yeah, and at the time, all the transits were private. They were private monopolies. They were private companies, and basically they went to the city and said, give us a monopoly on the bus route or the light rail route. But you're right, those are the people that were hurt. The companies that ran the buses, the companies that ran the light rail systems. And so they went right to the city councils and said, you've got to stop this. This is driving us out of business. This is terrible. And they claimed that it was unsafe, that people didn't have the right insurance and one thing and another. But they basically outlawed a free market transportation system. You know, you wonder why all these cars come in that are empty every day, because there's no way people can organize to give people rides. The way it would be now is people would be able to say, okay, I'm driving from Livermore to San Francisco for $5. You can ride with me. They'd stop at a stop. People would get in, $5, $3. The price would be determined. The price would signal between the demand and the supply, and transportation congestion would be reduced dramatically, except it's illegal, right? You can give people a ride for free. You can't charge them. So we have part of our problem is the roads being socialized. Part of the problem is alternatives being restricted. My friend in Colorado Springs, 2 daughters in high school, Kathy and her kids had a tennis coach, part-time job as a tennis coach, and he decided that he wanted to offer services, giving people a ride at night that had too much to drink in downtown, actually in downtown Fort Collins. So he had a sign on his window and he advertised, said, look, you need a ride home? I'll give you a ride home at night and I'll take you back to your car in the morning. Don't drive while you're intoxicated. So that was his part-time business. He coached tennis during the day and he did this driving in the evening. He's pulled over by the police and threatened with jail if he doesn't stop his business. Why? Because he doesn't have a permit. He says, well, look, I'm just giving people a ride. I've got insurance. Why can't I do that? Well, the taxi companies have monopolies for taxi services, and he can't get a permit to drive a taxi. He doesn't want to drive a taxi. He just wants to help people earn some money driving people home. So then he says, okay, I'll change it so I won't insist on money. People can give me a donation if they want to, but I won't charge them anything. They can pay me if they decide to. So he did that for a while and he got pulled over and threatened with arrest. So then the next thing, my friend Kathy set up a nonprofit foundation. He wouldn't accept money under any circumstances, but he'd just hand people an envelope, and they could, if they wanted to, mail a donation to the foundation that would pay him. And then he got pulled over and threatened with arrest for that. So what happens in Fort Collins now? People drink too much and try and drive home, and they get in accidents. But this is an entrepreneur who tried to offer a transportation service, and he's not allowed to because of the established taxi and bus industry doesn't allow that. That's one of 1,000 different examples of searchers trying to provide services and planners with their big central plans getting in the way. Another fun example is from college campuses. They build these new college campuses, new buildings, and the planners set up the pathways that they want students to walk from building to building. They build these trails and walkways and pathways from one place to another, lay them out with bricks. They get this whole thing set up, but guess what? Do you suppose college students care where the paths are? No, college students make their own decision on how they want to get from building A to building B. So the example that my friend Russ Sobel talks about, they built this campus area and the kids started walking directly across the lawn, and that irritated the campus people because they'd built this trail. It was a little longer, but that's the way they wanted people to go. Kids were walking across the lawn, so they went out there and they put a bunch of benches in the way of this path, and kids would then jump over the benches. They put other obstacles to try and get kids to stop, and they would fight through them, and they decided the way they wanted to get, and they break things, whatever they do, to do it their own way. So now the way they do it on campuses, people that are in architecture have figured out the new way to do it. They build the buildings and everything, and they don't build paths. They just leave it open. And they wait about 6 months and look at where the kids walk. And wherever they find the worn out trail where the students walk, that's where they go in and build the paths later. Because they can't plan how college students are going to decide to go from A to B. They can only wait to see what happens and then build a path to accommodate it. Again, it's an interesting story of planners versus the searchers. Transportation innovation. What's the best way to transport people from home to work and back? We don't know. Maybe via electrons. That is, thinking outside the box. Maybe we don't want to transport people from home to work. Maybe they should be able to work from home. Of course, that's illegal in much of the country to work from home. The state tries to stop it in various ways. But maybe Skype is going to have a holographic Skype program where you can be a holographic 3D image sitting in a chair with just minor static and people can see through you, but generally you're there. But maybe that's a better way for people to work. There's new people working on that technology as an alternative. What about sending people to work through pneumatic tubes? Now that may sound strange to you, but it's actually pretty cool. It ties into space exploration and other things. Chicago, you may or may not know, Chicago has a pneumatic tube system. The downtown was connected through these tubes. So this is the tube system in, it's either Macy's or one of the big department stores that connected all the departments in the store. So basically, people would put something in an envelope and it comes down, and this guy would take it from here and put it to there, and it would go shooting up. These tubes connected different buildings. So instead of the post office, they would be sending their letters through pneumatic tubes, and it would be delivered around the city. In fact, that's a different way. If you think about how much traffic is transportation, trucks, sending things back and forth in the city. What if we had pneumatic tubes, and instead of UPS trucks everywhere, these things would just appear in a tube at your house because they'd be sent, it's air that pushes them through. Well, it's an interesting, and so they have, here's what they have in the bank. If you've seen these in a bank, you put your check in this thing and it shoots up. Yeah.
So you're suggesting something like how cable service would work for your cable TV, except you have a pneumatic tube service that goes directly to your house?
Yeah. A couple feet wide, and packages just pop out on your door. They could shoot up 20 feet in the air if they came out at high speed, all sorts of stuff. They're not breakable. So they had these sorts of things. They tried this before. It's an interesting alternative to the status quo. In fact, there were proposals of sending people through pneumatic tubes. Here's the Lira Italian pneumatic tube postage stamp. This is from Futurama, I guess they were doing this. Here's people in a pneumatic tube here. But actually, interestingly, the US space program was reinvigorated by a professor, and this is part of a different talk on space exploration, but Gerard K. O'Neill was a physics professor at Princeton teaching physics to undergraduates, and his undergraduates were bored with physics. How many of you have taken physics? Did you find it boring or interesting? A little bit. Well, O'Neill, trying to get his students interested, said, we're going to learn physics, and here's what we're going to do. We're going to design space colonies. We're going to figure out how to put space colonies in space, where to put them, how they're going to work, and that's the way we're going to use physics. So he taught his class space colonies as they're teaching them physics. That actually led to an entire space organization, the L5 Society, that has hugely influenced space exploration and the private space people today. And they designed colonies in space that would spin and do various things. But one of the other things he designed was pneumatic tubes to do high-speed transportation from the East Coast to the West Coast. What if you have a pneumatic tube like this underground, 5, 6, 8 feet across, that people could sit in? What are your constraints on the speed limit? Let's say going from the East Coast to the West Coast if you're in a pneumatic tube. Again, you can take the air out of it. It can be in a complete vacuum. How fast could you go from the East Coast to the West Coast?
As fast as you wanted.
Yeah.
As fast as you could do.
Yeah, you speed. Now, he designed a way where the energy would be transferred. So the problem is you could get up to incredibly fast speeds, but then how do you stop? You could stop quickly, but your passengers are a pancake at the bottom of the tube, right? So you've got to speed up and slow down. But he basically 5, 10, 20,000 miles an hour, not 20,000 miles an hour, 5 or 10,000 miles an hour, because you don't have the problem with the sound barrier. You can go super high speed. So anyway, that was their effort to say we can save money and go super fast across the country by building these tubes and using magnetic acceleration so that one is decelerating, accelerating the other. Again, we don't know the best way to get from place A to B. Maybe it's pneumatic tubes, maybe it's jitneys, maybe it's light rail. My proposal, by the way, is, most light rail systems lose a ton of money. The one in Oregon, Portland, that people talk about as being great, that actually costs like $18 per passenger is what it costs the state and the federal government through subsidies. They're very, very expensive systems. Who makes money on light rail? Are there any for-profit companies that are making a lot of money running light rail, sending millions of people a day on light rail rides? Any idea? Anybody been to Disneyland or Six Flags? Do you see a light rail system there?
Disneyland's got the monorail, but...
They've got the monorail, but what about all the other rides? They're taking people 80 miles an hour upside down. I mean, the amusement park rides at amusement parks are actually transporting a ton of people really fast and inexpensively from place to place. Now, it turns out they're just going around in circles. But if you wanted to design a light rail around the Bay Area, maybe the Disneyland technology would be better than the system they have in Santa Clara and other places. Now, a lot of people don't want to go upside down when they're on light rail, but you can have different paths for the young people versus the old people. But the point is, we want to have competition. We don't know the best kind of technologies, but a lot of this light rail looks like it's trains 100 years old. So the challenge is to look for better ways to do that. My presentation's been about markets and prices and competition. One of the challenges is with government agencies, we don't have competition, we have monopolies. And one of the challenges is that government agencies tend to expand. There's something called mission creep. They try and take on more things. And this ties in with US foreign policy in an interesting way. I'm going to start this, and it may sound odd for a while, and then it'll keep sounding odd, but reforming federal, foreign, and forest policy. Sounds weird, but in this idea of the Forest Service, imagine the topic is on the Forest Service, debate topic. I have a whole presentation on the Forest Service then and now, how the Forest Service mission creep, expanding to do new things. Forest Service alternatives, private forests versus government forests. I have a presentation on that. And then Forest Service in Europe. Now, okay, this overhead and the next one are almost the same, except this one talks about the Forest Service, and this one talks about NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now that may seem bizarre. Here's one agency that's defending Europe against the Soviet Union, or was. But NATO, the Soviet Union's gone, NATO's still there. Right? NATO was there to defend Western Europe against invasion of Soviet tanks. Now the Soviet tanks are all rusting someplace. They're not much of a concern. The Soviet Union's gone. NATO's still there. The same thing I said on Forest Service has a history, has a mission creep, expanding to new things, and has alternatives. I don't know if this is mind-bending or just weird, but I figure you'll put up with it for a few minutes, and then, because you know we're almost at the end. Little history of NATO. This is an early poster for NATO. The fruit of cooperation. We're all work together. So NATO had a problem. Soviet Union fell. You think that NATO budgets would fall. People say we don't need NATO anymore. Before 9/11 and terrorism, there was an effort by NATO to find new things to do. And you could go to the NATO website and learn about that. Here's their little education and security project. They figure the Forest Service has a Smokey Bear. You know Smokey Bear? Wait, is it Smokey Bear or Smokey the Bear?
Smokey the Bear.
Actually, the Forest Service has spent $10 million in a public relations campaign to persuade the public to say Smokey Bear rather than Smokey the Bear. It's not clear why the "the" was such an obstacle, but it was, and they wanted to get rid of it. Similarly, NATO, you can go online and discover NATO, Pakistan relief operations. There's publications, maps, posters, there's games, little NATO games. So this is NATO in mission creep. This is the federal government trying to find new things to do. So terrorism, they're fighting terrorism because they don't have Soviets. They're funding science, security through science. They fund youth camps for Danish students, so Danish students can learn about NATO. They catch pirates. So NATO's got a new job to catch pirates, except they're catching pirates of the North Atlantic for NATO. NATO does lots of things. They have greeting cards. If you want to send somebody a greeting card with a picture of a space weapon that could destroy someone, they have a nice, attractive, colorful thing. NATO's branched out to new things. NATO's actually funded landscaping conferences. You know, NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, people working together. Why not work together on landscaping? I can think of a couple reasons, but apparently they couldn't. So they funded a landscaping conference. Now you could argue that in defending Western Europe from Soviet tanks, landscaping that had like barriers and troughs, the tanks would fall into those, and maybe somehow your landscaping could look attractive but provide for national defense at the same time. Maybe landscaping across the Mexican border could, you know, reduce illegal immigration and look attractive. So anyway, so landscaping, I'm not an opponent of landscaping, I just don't see how it fits with national defense. The Forest Service is into landscaping too. That makes sense, the Forest Service, U.S. Forest Service landscaping. Here's a conference they funded on landscaping in Central Africa. Well, Central Africa needs landscaping, just like the U.S. does, so the Forest Service decides to fund a program in Central Africa to help the Africans learn about landscaping from the Forest Service. You know, if this sounds strange to you, it should. Fortunately, you didn't hear about most of it, so they don't advertise it. But each of these organizations is trying to find new things to do. So after the economic crash in 2008, how do you suppose the Forest Service responded to that? What would the Forest Service have to do with the financial downturn and the crash and jobs lost and Bear Stearns going bankrupt and all that stuff? Any ideas? Well, we've got a problem with unemployment. So the Forest Service launched a new program to deal with that. The Forest Service is using funding for the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act to create jobs in the forest. And you can go out in the forest and whatever it is people do in the forest. But the idea is, the thing is that each of these government agencies, when 9/11 came and U.S. planes crashed and people died, it was a tragedy. The Forest Service responded by asking for money to have a special pathway in one of their forests that was commemorating the people that died on 9/11. So there's these pathways where you can walk around in a forest and, you know, think about 9/11. But one question is that something the Forest Service should do? The thing is, when a crisis comes, every agency comes up and says, here's new things we could do to help get some of this money. So the financial crisis, the agencies go and try and create jobs. Here's the forests in California, or I guess that would be Oregon. I'm from Washington, so I get confused. These are the forests in Oregon. All these colors are government forests, right? These are government agencies that run the forest. So one question might be, if this is a communist country, a socialist country, then of course the government should own assets, should own stuff. But if it's a market economy based on private property, why would the state and federal governments own the forests? Why wouldn't the forest be owned by people, by everyday people, forest companies or people that want to buy forests?
Is that the everyday people from our forests?
Yeah, so everyday people might like cut down trees. Maybe everyday people can't be trusted in the forest. Maybe they start forest fires, right? So the government is here to protect us and to protect the forests, but this represents a shift around 1890s, a shift both in our foreign policy that launched us in the Spanish-American War and sort of a owning territory around the world, and it changed our U.S. policy. The Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management was the federal government deciding that they could better manage land. So instead of land being transferred to the states or to private owners, the federal government kept control of the land. And you can see the change in policies. The states that came into the Union before the 1890s have private property. The states that came into the Union after the 1890s have government property. Government owns 50% of all the property west of the Mississippi. I think when you count Alaska, like 90% of Alaska. It's a big mess. And you can see Bureau of Indian Affairs, Bureau of Land Management, Reclamation, Defense, Fish and Wildlife. All these lands are owned by different government agencies. The Political Economy Research Center has a map. They use red to show like socialism, communism. But so this is to protect the forests, right? But if you look at the story, the first national forest set aside 100 years ago. The idea is the government was going to provide a continuous flow of timber. The reason why the government pushed into forests is private developers couldn't be trusted. People felt that we were going to run out of trees. And the government stepped in to stop private timber people from cutting down all the trees. By the 1980s, 25% of lumber was provided by the Forest Service. This has dropped. Timber harvests in national forests have declined 80% since 1985. So the current agency mission, instead of providing a flow of trees, is to prevent forest fires. Well, how's that working so far? It turns out the massive forest fires are generally on government land. They're caused by government policy. When they reduce by 80% cutting timber and selling wood, do the trees like stop growing? Do the trees say, okay, we're not going to get cut down anymore, so we'll stop growing? Well, a lot of the trees die from pine borer beetle and mismanagement from the Forest Service, but one thing they do is they get dry and they burn down. So these massive forest fires in Fort Collins, in Colorado, and California, and elsewhere tend to be linked to poor policies in not allowing timber to be cut down because of environmental efforts to slow it. So I like this idea of visualizing the state, that government, like fire, a fearful servant and a terrible master, and actually government very much like fire, burning down the trees. And this is the management of the national forests and the national parks, species loss and other things has been, I would argue, a disaster. Okay, transportation, forest, space, NATO. Did I miss anything? I guess I missed segues to connect the different parts, but apart from that, kitchen sinks, I actually have, no. Okay, thank you very much.